Today, more household trouble in the land of Oz Part 2, postcode analysis. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news. Well, today I'm going to take my discussion from a week ago further forward, where I went into the analysis of mortgage stress, rental stress, and financial stress across Australia. And one of the things that I suggested in my previous show was that I would be able to deep dive into individual postcodes if you asked for those. And today, that's what I'm going to do. So we'll walk through a series of postcodes and discuss the specifics with regard to what's going on. Before I do that, just a quick acknowledgement of the conversations and comments in the chat. Really appreciated them. The few trolls there, well, I just ignore those, but the bulk of the conversation was really positive. And by the way, the show did really well. Views were 4.3% higher than usual. And we were able to bring in another 160 subscribers so far. If you've not visited the earlier show, go back and check it out. But I will just give you a brief summary now, just so you understand what I'm talking about. So we run our core market model. It's a continuous analysis based on household surveys. We update that at the end of each month, and that then feeds into our modeling. The modeling allows us to slice and dice the data all sorts of different ways, but specifically look also at what may be happening ahead using our scenarios. And we take the mortgage stress information, the price trajectory data, the buying and selling intentions from the surveys, the migration data, the broader economic, the CPI, wages, employment data. We put it all into the core market model, run it through the various scenarios, and then we can look at it at the postcode level, roll up to a region, state, or Australia level, and also make some suggestions as to where prices may go on a scenario basis. By the way, if you're interested in a deep conversation about a particular suburb, I do offer my one-to-one service. I will just say this is an individual confidential discussion with me. It's not financial advice, but it's based on my modeling, looking at underlying trends, the stress information, some thoughts in terms of scenarios, all based on my modeling. You can book a time for a chat, either via Zoom or a phone conversation. Runs for up to an hour. There is a cost involved because there's a lot of detailed research to be done to be able to dig into it. And if you are interested in contacting me, you can do that via the DFA blog. Links are below. Booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead, simply because there's a lot of demand for this particular service, particularly at the current environment. Now, also, let me just remind you again, when I talk about stress, I'm talking about cash flow measures. That's not a specific, they say 30% of income or taxable income. It's not based on underwriting metrics. It's based on money in, money out. If households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items than income, we define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If they're renting, they're in rental stress. We can also look at investors as well. And we can aggregate the data to estimate the total financial stress. And we will be talking about the percentage of households and also the count. In many ways, I think the count is a better measure because it's a rule of big numbers. And just another way of thinking about this, again, going back to the RBA chart they put up a few months ago, mild stress is when you have budget pressures that can intensify and then you start missing payments and maybe ultimately go insolvent over a period of time. That's severe stress. I am measuring stress in my modeling at the mild end, but it's a symptom of what may happen later. And this was the data that we published a week ago that showed you that mortgage stress and rental stress has accelerated. We start with rental stress. 77.3% of those in the rental sector have cash flow pressures. That's an all-time high. It's a disaster. And mortgage stress is also extremely high as well. More than half of households with mortgages have significant financial pressures of various sorts, up from 32.9% before COVID hit. And finally, just before we get into the detail, let me say once again, our scenarios are a way of exploring different futures to think about sensitivities. They're not a forecast. And that's where some of the trolls come in and say, your forecasts are wrong. No, they are scenarios, they are sensitivities. And we use those sensitivities based on where we are today and looking forward. They do change, of course. There are three. The best case is the Goldilocks zone, where rates stay at 4.35% and then fall later. The soft landing is that we see rates around 4.35%, but inflation falls later, but rises again and stays above target. We don't get a recession in Australia, but migration starts to fall. And then the worst case, the nightmare scenario, where we see rate rises higher than 4.35%. They stay high through 24 into 2025. Unemployment starts to rise, wages growth stalls, and we get a recession locally. So those are the three scenarios. We could run others, but those are the three that we do. So with that out of the way, let me now start and go through those specific requests from individual followers for a specific postcode. And what we'll do in each case is look at the specific post and then look at the extract from my model down at the postcode level. So here's the first one from Gerard Reagan, 812. Great work, Martin. Could you please review postcode 2250, which is Gosford in New South Wales? Yep, here we go. So Gosford, which includes West Gosford, North Gosford, East Gosford, and a few other areas as well. We do it at a postcode level, of course. And I'll walk you through the specifics here in terms of the information. As always, we start with the count of households in the postcode. That's based off the census and adjusted as necessary if migration is strong. We then split it out between those who are owning outright, those who are borrowing, and those who are renting. So you can see here that the mortgage belt, 38% is pretty high, 31% are renting, and 30% are owning outright. We then look at the mortgage stress data based on the analysis that we've done. Only around 20% in mortgage stress, but there's a lot of rental stress there, more than 94%. And you can see that's 8,500 there. Some stressed investors, overall financial stress is 43.5%. And that is a pretty high number. You can see there it's highlighted as such. What we then do is to look at the mix of property. So 69% are houses, 16% are units, and 14% are other types of property. We can also look at the people ratio. So people ratio is telling us something about the mix of people in the area. So 2.31 is quite high. That essentially suggests this is more families than individuals. The vacancy rate is also there as well. The vacancy rate is based on the last census data, but it also is interesting to watch that in some areas with lots of second homes and Airbnb, the vacancy rates are quite high. We then have the gross and net investment yields. So the gross investment yield is the relative between price and the theoretical rental income that might be generated in this particular postcode. The net investment yield is the difference between the costs of all the property versus the income that you actually get from a rental perspective. In this case, it's slightly negative, as you can see, minus 0.1. We also then have data on the taxable income based on the ATO data and the household census. And you can see here it's 77,000 versus 84,000. That then gives us a disposable monthly income, on average, 5,160. And then we look at the percentage going on the mortgage at 46.5%, or more than $2,400 a month at the moment. And that going in the rent at 38.6%, 1,993 a month on average. We can also then look at the scenarios, and based on the best, base and worst case scenarios for houses, there is a scenario where prices continue to rise over the next 3 years, up to 9% over 3 years. The base case for houses is a fall of about 10% over 3 years. The worst case is a more significant fall. Units tend to follow on, although the downside may be a little less severe. Let's go on to the next one now. This is from Aaron W7512, a great show. I've just purchased in Coolump, Western Australia, 6210. Would love to see stats on that suburb. Sure. Here we go. So this is actually including Meadow Springs and Mandurah. So it's the south of Perth area. And here we have 31,000 households in the postcode, of which 35% own outright, 36.8% are borrowing, and 28% are renting. Looking at the mortgage stress, it's 22.7%. Looking at the rental stress, it's 74%. Some stressed investors as well, and the overall financial stress metric is 34.6%. 81% of houses in the area, small number of units and other types of property. People ratio at 1.87 shows that there are some individuals and some households there. The vacancy rate is very high at 17.1%. Now that's partly to do with second homes and Airbnb. I think at the time the census was run, of course, this is just around the COVID time as well, so maybe artificially high, but it is interesting that the vacancy rates are pretty high there. We also know that there are some properties that are for sale and vacant as well. Gross investment yield is 4.1%. Net investment yield is just positive at 0.1%. Looking at the taxable income, 87,000 from the ATO and 63,000 from the household census. The disposal monthly is around $4,000, and the borrowing story shows about half of people's income, just over $2,000 going on the typical mortgage and 37.2% going on the typical rental at 1,495. Looking at the scenarios, there is still a scenario where in the best case we see significant price growth over the next 3 years, maybe as high as 21%. The base case, which is probably more likely, is a small rise. The worst case is a fall, maybe down 18% over 3 years, again, based on the scenarios. Units behaving a little less severely, as we often see. Now I'm going to look at the next one, Sun's visual 9342, and ask for postcode 3021. So postcode 3021 includes Alban Vale, Kings Park and St Albans. Here we have 19,000 households in the postcode, of which 36% own outright, 29% are borrowing, and 33% are renting. Mortgage stress is pretty high at 51.6%. That's more than 2,900 households. Rental stress is even higher at 87%, more than 5,500. Some stressed investors as well. But the net of all this is that households in financial stress is more than half of households in the postcode. Looking at the property mix, 80% of houses, some units and other types of property there too. People ratio is quite high there, mostly households with families. Vacancy rates are 6.8%. Gross investment yield is 3.3%, but the net investment yield is a horrible minus 0.7%. So many investors are underwater, not surprising given those statistics. Looking at the taxable income, around 58,000 from the ATO, 64,000 from the household census, so slightly higher but quite close. More than $4,200 on average per month disposable, with 42% going on the mortgage at $1,800 and 38.3%, $1,619 going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, well, unfortunately, even in the best case scenario, we are expecting a sensitivity that shows falls in houses over the next 3 years, maybe down 5%. The base case, a more significant fall, down 24%. In the worst case, a horrible 46%. Units still also showing a fall, perhaps not quite as much. Moon Manchu asks for postcode 2213. 2213 is in East Hills and Picnic Point in the Sydney district. And here we have 8,500 households in the postcode. 33% own outright, 40% are borrowing, and 26% are renting. 35% with a mortgage are in stress. 90% of those renting have a rental stress problem, and 26% of investors are stressed, giving a household financial stress measure of above 53%. Looking at the property mix, 70% are houses, 4.5% of units, 24% other types. That can include things like accommodation over shops and other types of properties too. People ratio is quite high at 2.73, so these are mostly families. The vacancy rate is just 5%. Gross investment yield is 3.5%, but the net investment yield is minus 0.1%. Looking at the average taxable income, 81,000 from the ATO, 110,000 from the household. Where we see that disparity, it suggests that more than one income is going on the mortgage. We're looking at the disposable monthly income, $6,400 on average, 48% going on the typical mortgage with a payment of just over $3,100. And from a rental perspective, 36.5% going on the rent at $2,343 a month. And looking at the scenarios, well, the best case scenario is there is still potential rise ahead, maybe 6.8% over 3 years. But the base case is a fall of 12%, and the worst case is a fall of more than 1/3. And looking at units, rather similar. The fall might be slightly less, though. Now, the next one is from Living Oracle. Hello, Martin. 3064 and 3754, please. And very happy to do those. So firstly, 3064 is the Roxburgh Park area, including Donnybrook and Mickleham. And there we have 34,000 households in the place with, wait for it, 60% borrowing and 26% renting. Mortgage stress is quite high at 45%. That's more than 9,500 in that particular postcode. 70% of those in rental stress, more than 6,400. Some stressed investors, overall financial stress at 47%. 91% of houses, a small number of units and other types of property. People ratio is very high at 3.19, so a lot of families here. The vacancy rate is 5.4%. Gross investment yield is 3.1%. Net investment yield is minus 0.7%. Looking at the ATO data, 65,000 on an individual basis, 94,000 on the household basis. That tells me that there are multiple incomes going to pay the mortgage. That gives a disposable monthly income around $5,600, with 40%, $2,280 going on the typical mortgage, and a third, $1,899 a month going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios in terms of the prices ahead, even in the best case scenario, we don't see much in the way of rises over the next 3 years. The base case, a fall, and the worst case, a more significant fall. Units following suit. Now looking at the next one, postcode 3754, including Doreen and Mandurah. Here, 17,200 households with 15% owning outright. 59% are borrowing, 24% are renting. High levels of mortgage stress at 71%, more than 7,400. 90% in rental stress at 3,700. And overall financial stress at 67%. 92% of houses, small number of other types of property. People ratio is quite high at 2.89, so a lot of households here. Gross investment yield is 3%. Net investment yield is minus 0.4%. Average taxable is 74,000. The household census at 108, so once again, multiple incomes going to pay the mortgage. Disposable monthly is $6,700 a month on average, with 34.9% going on the typical mortgage at $2,354 and the typical rent at 28%, $1,944. Looking at the scenarios, significant falls even in the best case scenario in the next 3 years. The base case, a more significant fall, and the worst case, falling off a cliff, and units following suit. Now we look at Zim Dang Gold. Hi Martin, postcode 3109, please. So 3109 is Doncaster East, including Doncaster Heights and Tunstall Square. There are 11,500 households, with 42% owning outright, a third borrowing, and 23% are renting. Mortgage stress is at 45%, rental stress is at 90%, and overall financial stress is 47%. Property mix, 63% houses, quite a few units and other types of property there too. The people ratio at 2.49 is saying houses with families. People ratio is high. The vacancy rate is about average at 8.9%. Gross investment yield is at 3.3%, but the net investment yield is minus 1%. That's the highest we've seen in terms of losses so far. 81,000 for the average taxable, 93,000 for the household census, giving a disposable monthly of around 5,500, with 51.8% going on the typical mortgage at 2,800 a month, and 41%, 2,300 going on the typical rent. Scenarios would suggest falls, even in the best case scenario, of about 6% over 3 years. The base case, a fall of 26%, and the worst case, even higher. The units are following suit as well. Taz 1962B asks for postcode 3465. 3465 is Maryborough and other areas in the area there, including Simpson and Majorca. So we see 4,600 households there, with 47% owning outright, 27% borrowing, and 24% renting, 88% in mortgage stress, 82% in rental stress, and overall financial stress, 51%. 89% of houses, a small number of other types of property. The people ratio at 1.92 is a little lower, so it might be some sole families there too. The vacancy rate's a little higher at 9.7%. Gross investment yield's 3.1%. Net investment yield is minus 0.8%. Average taxable is 61,000. The household census said 47,000, giving a disposal monthly around 3,200, with 40% going on the typical mortgage at 1,284 and 37% at 1,196 going on the typical rent. Looking at the scenarios, worst case, a significant fall of 9% over the next 3 years. Base case, down 28%. The worst case, down 49%. And the units following suit. Fred Flintstone, 7924, said, "Thanks so much. This is really a terrific contrast to the traditional news channel that only seem to interview agents, advocates, and similar stakeholders that have a pecuniary interest in constantly talking up the market. Indeed, I appreciate the unbiased reasoning and analysis." Great to hear. Thanks for that. Could I request the following postcodes if possible? Frankston, Blairgowrie, Ocean Grove, and Geelong. Yep, of course. So let's do Frankston first, 3199. There we have 23,000 households with 29% owning outright, 37% borrowing, 32% renting. Mortgage stress is at 70%, rental stress is at 80%, overall financial stress at 56%. 77% of houses, 4.7% units and other types of property, 18%. People ratio is 2.19%, so that's families as well as sole. Vacancy rate 6.8%, with gross investment at 3.1. Net investment yield is minus 0.8%. I'll make the point, a lot of postcodes in Victoria are underwater from an investment perspective. One reason why many investors are selling. Individual taxable from the ATO, 73,000, from the census, 79,000, giving a disposal monthly around 5,200, with 42%, 2,214 going on a typical mortgage, and 33% going on the rent. That's 1,745. Looking at the scenarios, a fall of 5% over the next 3 years on the best case scenario, 25% base case, 45% worst case for houses. Units also following suit. Now looking at 3942, Blairgowrie on the Mornington Peninsula. It's a very low count, so be careful with some of this data. 59% owning outright, 26% borrowing, 13% of renting. We didn't detect any mortgage stress, but it's a very low count. A lot of rental stress, but again, a low count. And around 20% in financial stress overall. Mostly houses. People ratios quite low, so clearly maybe a lot of people using second homes, and indeed we see that with 65% vacant. So Airbnb, a lot of second homes. So again, be careful with this data. Gross investment yield is 3.5, but the net investment yield is still minus 0.4%. Average taxable is 90,000. The individual household was 77,000 from the census. That gives us disposal monthly of 4,593, giving 52% going on the typical mortgage, 2,400, and 43% going on the typical rent at 1,993. But of course, if these are second homes, then these might be distorted. From a scenario perspective, maybe a small rise over the next 3 years, but the base case is a fall of 18% and the worst case, a more significant fall, and units follow suit. Now we look at Ocean Grove on the Surf Coast in and around Geelong. 6,900 there, with 41% owning outright, 39% borrowing and 90% renting. Mortgage stress at 41%, rental stress very high indeed. The overall financial stress metric, 41%. 93% are houses, small number of units and the types of property. People ratio is 1.98%. Quite high vacancy rates, 21%. Again, second homes and Airbnb probably figuring in here. Gross investment yield is 3.3, net investment yield minus 0.1%. Average taxable is 81,000. Household census, 95,000. and that gives a disposal monthly of 5,858, with 41% of 2,400 going on typical mortgage and 35%, 2,000 or a bit more than that, 2,093 going on typical rental. And looking at the scenarios, a bit of a fall in the best case, a significant fall of more than 24% under the base case, and a very significant fall under the worst case scenarios, units following suit. And we go to Newtown, again in Geelong, with 7,350 households there, 34% owning outright, 29% borrowing, 36% renting, 91% in mortgage stress, 81% in rental stress, overall financial stress, 59%, all very high figures, 67% of houses, 10% of units, and there are some other types of property there too. People ratio is just over 2. The vacancy rate at 11.8% is probably high enough to suggest some Airbnb and second homes is there too as well. 3.1% is the gross investment yield, net investment yield minus 1.5%. Average taxable is 102,000 and the household census said 98,000. That gives a disposal monthly of around 6,400, with 39% going on the typical mortgage, 2,500, and 28%, 1,794 going on the typical rental. Scenarios would suggest falls in the best case scenario for around 8%, base case down 28%, and the worst case even more significant falls, units following suit. Now, DPM 5964 says postcode 6026, please, from Dale in Perth. So 6026 is Kingsley and Woodvale. 8,600 households in the postcode, 41% owning outright, 47% are borrowing, and 11% are renting. We have 25% in mortgage stress, just over 1,000. Pretty much everybody in the rental sector struggling with cash flow. Overall financial stress at 27%. 87% of houses, other types of property there as well, of course. 2.53 is the people ratio, so that's going to include some families. Vacancy rate's very low at 4.2. Gross investment yield's 4.4. Net investment yield is just positive 0.1%, one of the few that we've seen positive today. Average taxable is 86,000. The household census said 111,000, so multiple incomes going to pay the mortgage. Disposable monthly income is around $6,500, with 38% going on the typical mortgage, more than $2,500, and 33%, $2,190, going on the typical rental. So looking at the scenarios typical of Western Australia, we see significant rises, maybe as high as 19% over the next 3 years. That's the best case scenario. Base case would be as a relatively small fall, and the worst case scenario would be a fall of around 20%. Units following somewhat similarly. And as I've said before, Western Australia has seen a significant rise in prices. Remember, of course, they did fall significantly after the early 10s and 11s when they dropped. And of course, we've still got an overhang of mortgage stress, and defaults are highest in Western Australia too. So it's not altogether a completely positive picture. Nevertheless, relative to other states, Western Australia still has upside potential, possibly. So that takes us to the end of the requests. I hope that I managed to pick them all up from the comments. And let me just say that if you have an interest in a particular postcode, you can still send me a message via my blog, and I'll happily send you the one-page summary for that postcode over the next few days. I may well decide to do one more show when I look at the geomapping of our stress information. If you think that would be of interest, drop a comment, please. And if I get enough comments, I'll make the show. And now, just before I go, let me just make the point that you can, of course, get hold of the full data set. This is available via our Patreon program. We actually run a series of programs on Patreon. Thank you very much for all those who support what we do via the Patreon system. We really appreciate it. And the one that's relevant here, if you want the information, is the DFA stress data set. It's $50 a month plus GST. And for all those who subscribed, we'll be sending this information out in the next 24 hours now that we've made this show. And if you would like to get hold of the more than 2,000 or thereabouts postcodes with the data set, it's available if you want to subscribe via Patreon. And of course, you can subscribe just for a month to get one series, or indeed continue to subscribe and be updated each month. We have quite a few people who do subscribe to this on an ongoing basis, and we really appreciate the support through our Patreon program. So I want to say thank you very much for watching this show, and I hope that was informative. Thank you all for all those who asked for specific information, and check back for the next show, which of course will be covering finance and property and some of the broad economic and macro economics that we actually talk about. And by the way, on Tuesday in my live show, Veronica Morgan will be on. Now, Veronica Morgan, of course, is a buyer's agent based in Sydney, but is also very, very interested in some of these broader economic and social issues. And through the Elephant in the Room podcast with Chris Bates, she discusses a lot of these issues. And we're going to be specifically looking at the contention between those in the rental sector and perhaps trying to get into the mortgage sector, in other words, buy somewhere to live, and some of the traps that people are actually encountering at the moment when they try to do that. So make a note in your diary for next Tuesday at 8 p.m. Sydney. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.